In this video, we're going to be going over lesson 9.3, dividing decimals. We're going to start by learning how to divide tenths by a whole number without regrouping. We're going to be using a place value chart to help us visualize what we're doing when we divide. So I went ahead and represented 8 tenths. Our problem is having us do 8 tenths divided by 2. So we can go ahead and separate our 8 tenths into 2 equal groups. When we do that, we would be left with 4 tenths in each of our 2 groups, which means that 8 tenths divided by 2 is equal to 4 tenths. We're going to take a look at the same example now using our long division method. So we start by dividing the ones by 2. So we would have 0 divided by 2, which is equal to 0, 1. So we're going to put a 0 up top. Then we go through and multiply next. 0 times 2 is equal to 0. Then we subtract. 0 minus 0 is 0. And then we bring down our 8. And our 8 is representing 8 tenths. Our next step is to divide our 8 tenths by 2, which is equal to 4. So we're going to put a 4 up in the tenths place. 4 times 2 is equal to 8, and 8 minus 8 is equal to 0. To figure out where we put our decimal point, all you have to do is move your decimal point straight up, making sure that you're lining up your place value, so your answer would be 4 tenths. Go ahead and try the next example all on your own, so pause the video as you work through it. 9 tenths divided by 3. We start by dividing our ones place. So we do 0 divided by 3, which is equal to 0. 0 times 3 is 0. 0 minus 0 is 0. We bring down our 9 tenths and do 9 tenths divided by 3, which is equal to 3 tenths. 3 tenths times 3 is equal to 9 tenths. We subtract and we get 0. Again, we're going to just move our decimal point straight up, making sure that we're keeping our place value lined up. So our answer is 3 tenths. Now we're going to take a look at an example that has 2 decimal places divided by a whole number. So we're going to start with 69 hundredths divided by 3. We're going to use the same process as we used when we divided tenths by a whole number. So we'll start by dividing our ones. So we do 0 divided by 3, which is equal to 0. 0 times 3 is 0. 0 minus 0 is 0. We bring down our 6 tenths. 6 tenths divided by 3 is equal to 2. 2 tenths times 3 is equal to 6 tenths. 6 tenths minus 6 tenths is 0. So we bring down our 9 hundredths. 9 hundredths divided by 3 is equal to 3 hundredths. 3 hundredths times 3 is equal to 9 hundredths. We go ahead and subtract and we get 0. To figure out where our decimal point is, we just move it straight up, making sure that our place value is lined up. So our answer is 23 hundredths. Go ahead and pause the video and try the next example on your own. 26 hundredths divided by 2. We're going to start by dividing our ones place. So we would do 0 divided by 2, which is equal to 0. 0 times 2 is 0. 0 minus 0 is 0. We bring down our 2 tenths. 2 tenths divided by 2 is equal to 1 tenth. 1 tenth times 2 is 2 tenths. 2 tenths minus 2 tenths is equal to 0. And we bring down our 6 hundredths. 6 hundredths divided by 2 is equal to 3. 3 hundredths times 2 is equal to 6 hundredths. And 6 hundredths minus 6 hundredths is 0. We move our decimal point straight up, and our answer would be 13 hundredths. Next, we're going to take a look at how to divide decimals with one decimal place by a whole number that includes regrouping. We're going to look at a visual model using our place value chart to show what we mean. Our example that we're going to look at is 8/10 divided by 5. I've represented 8/10. To divide 8/10 by 5, we would be separating our 8/10 into 5 equal groups. We can create 5 groups and have 3/10 left over. We would then have to regroup our 3/10 into our hundredths place. When we regroup 3/10, we get 30 hundredths, which I just drew in green. Now we can take our 30 hundredths and separate them into 5 equal groups. When we do that, each group would equal 6 hundredths. Now we can take a look at the total that we have in each group. When we separate it into our 5 groups, each group has 1/10 and 6 hundredths, which is equal to 16 hundredths. So 8/10 divided by 5 is equal to 16 hundredths. We're now going to take a look at using long division to solve that example. We would start by dividing our ones, so we would do 0 divided by 5, which is equal to 0. 0 times 5 is equal to 0. 0 minus 0 is 0. Then we bring down our 8/10. 8/10 divided by 5 is equal to 1/10. So we're going to put a 1 up top. 1/10 times 5 is equal to 5/10. Now when we go and subtract, we're left with 3/10. And so we have to take 3/10 and divide it by 5. When we regroup 3/10 into our hundredths, that's the same thing as putting a 0 next to the 8 so that we go to the hundredths place. We're going to bring that 0 down to show that we have 30 hundredths, and we're going to divide that by 5, which is equal to 6 hundredths. 6 hundredths times 5 is equal to 30 hundredths. And we subtract, and we're left with 0. We bring our decimal point straight up, and our answer is 16 hundredths. We're going to take a look at another example just like the last one that we did. This time we're going to do 9/10 divided by 2. We'll start by dividing our ones, so we'll do 0 divided by 2, which is equal to 0. 0 times 2 is 0. We subtract, 0 minus 0 is 0. Then we're going to bring down our 9/10 and do 9/10 divided by 2, which is equal to 4/10. 4/10 times 2 is equal to 8/10. When we subtract, we're left with 1/10, which we have to regroup into 10 hundredths, which means that we're going to put a 0 in the hundredth place so we can bring down our 0. So we have 10 hundredths, which when we divide by 2 is equal to 5 hundredths. So 5 hundredths times 2 is equal to 10 hundredths. We subtract and we get 0. So our answer when we bring our decimal point straight up is equal to 45 hundredths. For our next example, we're going to learn how to divide decimals with 2 decimal places by a whole number with regrouping. So I went ahead and represented 7 and 75 hundredths in our place value chart. So we have 7 ones, 7/10, and 5 hundredths. We're going to start by dividing our ones. So we're going to divide our 7 ones into 5 equal groups. When we do that, we're left with 2 ones left over, which we would then regroup over into our 10ths place. When we regroup our 2 ones into our 10th place, we would be adding 20 tenths to the 7 tenths that we already have, which means that we would have 27 tenths total. We would then take our 27 tenths and divide that into 5 equal groups. When we divide our tenths into 5 equal groups, we would have 2 tenths left over, and the rest of the groups would each be equal to 5 tenths. We would then have to take our 2/10 and regroup that into our hundredths place. When we regroup our 2/10 into our hundredths place, we are adding 20 hundredths to the 5 hundredths that are already there, which means that we have 25 hundredths. We're going to split those hundredths into 5 equal groups, which means that 5 hundredths would fit into each of our 5 groups. So now we can total up how many ones, tenths, and hundredths there are in each of our 5 groups. We have 1, 5/10, and 5/100ths, which means that 7 and 75/100ths divided by 5 is equal to 1 and 55/100ths. Now we'll use long division to solve that example. We'll start with our ones and do 7 divided by 5, which is equal to 1. 1 times 5 is 5. 7 minus 5 is 2. Then we bring down our 7/10 because we regrouped. So we have 27/10 divided by 5, which is equal to 5/10. 5/10 times 5 is equal to 25/10. So we're left with 2/10, which we then regroup into our hundredths. So we have 25 hundredths divided by 5, which is 5. Then 5 hundredths times 5 is 25 hundredths. We subtract. We bring our decimal point straight up, and we get 1 and 55 hundredths. Let's take a look at another example. We'll start by dividing our ones. So we'll do 0 divided by 2 is 0. 0 times 2 is 0. Subtract. Bring down our 9/10. 9/10 divided by 2 is 4. 4/10 times 2 is equal to 8/10. 9/10 minus 8/10 is equal to 1/10, which we regroup so that we have 12 hundredths. 12 hundredths divided by 2 is equal to 6 hundredths. 6 hundredths times 2 is equal to 12 hundredths. And we subtract, we get 0. We bring our decimal point straight up, and our answer is 46 hundredths. Go ahead and try the next example on your own. We'll start by dividing our ones. So we'll do 6 divided by 5, which is equal to 1. 1 times 5 is 5. 6 minus 5 is 1. We're going to regroup by bringing down our 0 in the tenths place. So we have 10/10 divided by 5, which is equal to 2/10. 2/10 times 5 is 10/10. We subtract, we get 0/10. And we're going to bring down our 5 hundredths. 5 hundredths divided by 5 is equal to 1. 1 times 5 is 5. 5 hundredths minus 5 hundredths is equal to 0. We bring our decimal point straight up. We're left with 1 and 21 hundredths. For our next example, we're going to find quotients to the nearest tenth. So we're going to start by dividing to 2 decimal places, and then we're going to be rounding our quotient to the nearest tenth. So we'll start by dividing our ones. So we have 5 ones divided by 8, which is equal to 0 ones. So we have 0 times 8, which is equal to 0. So we're left with 5 ones. We're going to regroup those 5 ones so that we have 50 tenths. So we're going to add in our decimal point there so that we know that we moved over to the tenths place. So we have 50 tenths divided by 8, which is equal to 6. 6 tenths times 8 is equal to 48 tenths. So we're left with 2 tenths, which we're going to regroup so that we have 20 hundredths. 20 hundredths divided by 8 is equal to 2 hundredths. 2 hundredths times 8 is equal to 16 hundredths. When we subtract, we get 4. Now, if you remember, we said that we were going to divide to 2 decimal places. And so we've now divided to 2 decimal places, so we're not going to keep going. So when we bring our decimal point up, we have 62 hundredths. Now we're going to be rounding 62 hundredths to the nearest tenth. So we're going to remember our rounding from Chapter 8. We're going to circle our rounding digit, which is our 6. We're going to look next door. If it's 5 or higher, 4 or lower. So since it's 4 or lower, that means that we just ignore. And so we're going to keep the 6. And since we're rounding to the tenths place, we don't worry about any other digits to the right of the tenths place. So when we round to the nearest tenth, we would get 6 tenths. For our last example, we're going to be finding quotients to the nearest hundredth. So since we're finding it to the nearest hundredth, this time we're going to divide to 3 decimal places instead of 2, and then we're going to round that to the nearest hundredth. So we'll start by dividing our 1, so we have 13 ones, divided by 8, which is equal to 1. 1 times 8 is equal to 8. We subtract, and we're left with 5 ones, which we're going to regroup. And since we're regrouping to make it 50 tenths, we're going to add in our decimal point so that we remember. And then bring down our 0 so that we have 50 tenths. 50 tenths divided by 8 is equal to 6 tenths. 6 tenths times 8 is equal to 48 tenths. 50 tenths minus 48 tenths is 2 tenths, which we're going to regroup into our hundredths place so that we have 20 hundredths. So we'll add another 0. 20 hundredths divided by 8 is equal to 2. 2 times 8 is equal to 16 hundredths. 20 hundredths minus 16 hundredths is equal to 4 hundredths. And we're going to regroup our 4 hundredths into 40 thousandths. 40 thousandths divided by 8 is equal to 5 thousandths. 5 thousandths times 8 is equal to 40 thousandths, which when we subtract, we get 0. So we bring our decimal point straight up. So this is why it's really important that we line up our place value, because as you can see, now that we have our quotient all the way to the thousandths place, we need to know where we put our decimal point. So we got 1 and 625 thousandths, which we're now going to be rounding to the nearest hundredth. So we're going to circle our rounding digit. We're going to look next door, 5 or higher. We add 1 more, so the 2 is going to become a 3. So it rounds to 1 and 63 hundredths.